Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I am the executive of the Synod of the Covenant, and I'm so glad to welcome you to this preaching workshop. We're so glad to have Laura von Wallmenich here from Alma College to teach us about storytelling. I will introduce her more fully in a minute, but wanted to welcome all of you who are here live with us today. Especially, we've got some friends from Santa Fe Presbytery joining. We're especially glad that you're here. And everyone that is watching this afterwards on YouTube, we're really glad you're here too, and pray that this workshop will help strengthen your preaching. I'm going to share some of the things that are going on in the life of the Synod. And so let me do that. Let me find the share button. Here we go. All right. David or Ian, can you see that? Can you tell me whether you see
Yes.
that? Great, thank you. So I usually give an announcement about looking for people who want to begin in our Cultivating the Gift of Preaching initiative. This is a 18-month cohort program to teach lay preaching, but it starts tomorrow, so it's too late to join. But we will be on the campus of Alma College beginning tomorrow, and there will be about, I
Ah,
think, 65 people for the conference there between participants and leaders. And again, it's designed to help lay people who have the gift of preaching to learn to preach. And we begin this every June. And so if you know people, I want to encourage them over the course of the year to take part. We would love to have them participate next year. I want to let you know while we're talking about things that we do for to support preaching. Next month's preaching workshop is not on the first Wednesday of the month. It's actually the second Wednesday of the month. It's July 8th with Safwat Marzouk. He teaches at Union Seminary in Richmond. He's going to lead a workshop on preaching about immigration. And in August, Deb Mumford from Louisville Seminary is going to lead on preaching justice with pictures. That will be the first Wednesday of the month, like all the other ones. We have a periodic racial justice series and a periodic Christian nationalism series. So I wanted to let you know about those that are upcoming. On Thursday, June 11th, Alexandra Zareth is leading a workshop on healing what we carry, race, trauma, and community life. The day before that, David Congdon of the University of Kansas is leading in our Christian nationalism series, The Theology of Christian Nationalism. We'd love to have you attend one or both of those. And also want to let you know that we are working hard on our ministry that will result from the grant we received from the OpenAI Foundation. Lisa Schrott is on this call. She's part of the steering committee that is getting going to help us figure out exactly what's the best way to offer ministry that will be helpful for our churches and our presbyteries and our leaders. And we hope to start piloting and start offering that in the fall. So keep your eyes open. We have three remaining Zoom trainings in 2026. They are, I think, in September, October, and November. These are by Zoom and they're free to you and your presbytery. You can find more information on our website if you need to take boundaries training. And you can contact me if you have any questions about any of this. No one else listens to my voicemail messages and nobody else reads my email. If I can be helpful to you or your church or your presbytery in any way, let me know. Today, I'm really excited to introduce Laura von Wallmenich from Alma College. She is leading storytelling to strengthen our preaching. I'm going to stop my share for a second and let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Here we go. Stop share so that I can actually look at her while I'm introducing her. Laura is an English professor at Alma College. That's my alma mater. It's the Presbyterian College in Michigan. And I have gotten to know her via her work for our Cultivating the Gift of Preaching initiative. Each of the entering classes has had a course from her on storytelling or a workshop from her on storytelling. She's not a preacher. She will tell you again and again that she's not a preacher, but she's bringing her gifts as an English professor to bear for preaching. And I'm really grateful for her, the way that she has been really thoughtful about helping students in the Cultivating the Gift of Preaching initiative to engage Scripture and to figure out how to bring it to life for for their listeners. I'm going to say a prayer and then turn it over to Laura. So let's turn to God in prayer. Gracious God, thank you so much for your work among us, your spirit among us, for giving us the chance to preach and the chance to strengthen our preaching. We thank you for Laura's willingness to lead this workshop. God bless her with the wisdom that you promise whenever we ask for it. Give us ears to hear and eyes to see and hearts to take in. We give you thanks, O God. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. So let's give Laura some happy hands. And Laura, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to post a link to a handout in the chat. One of the reasons for the handout is that I know that, as one of you already disclosed, some of you may be on this call, but maybe not as able to participate by talking. But the worksheet gives you a way to kind of follow along. I will warn you all that I am not a lecturer. I never lecture. All of my classes are either discussion-based or activity-based. So Zoom is terrifying for me. As part of that, I want to just invite you all to see this more as a conversation, as a dialogue. I would love it if you are using chat to raise questions. You do not have to worry about interrupting me. In fact, I'm pretty sure Chip will throughout this when I do the workshops on campus. One of the things that's been a real joy is that Chip will sort of jump in and say, oh, wait, but here's a connection because I am not a preacher. I am somebody who, in my own scholarship and teaching, is deeply steeped in oral traditions and in storytelling. I'm very passionate about storytelling for a reason you'll get a taste of in a little bit. But the purpose today is to explore what the role of preaching is in your own practice, to consider the value of what I call a 2-minute tale. And a 2-minute tale is it's a practice, it's an exercise in which you take a story that you want to share and you shape it and chisel it down to 2 minutes. Now it's okay if it's 2 minutes and 20, if it's 2 minutes, but you try and get to around 2 minutes. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's a really valuable practice, even if in many cases you may have to expand a little beyond that. Most of us, when we tell stories, overtell our stories. We go on too long, we elaborate too much, and this is an exercise that really hones your storytelling skills. We'll also talk and do some sharing of what some tools are that you can use to make your storytelling impactful. I assume in this workshop that as preachers, many of you already know a lot about storytelling. So that's part of why I really want to invite this to be a conversation. I want to begin by actually handing things back to Chip because I asked him to actually kick us off with some comments and some discussion about the role of storytelling and preaching so that we can ground this really in beginning to think about how this practice fits within the specific discipline and the specific work that you do as preachers.
Great. So I'm going to, I just found a button for replace current share. So I guess I can kick Laura off the sharing. And yeah, so I wanted to start just with a conversation, as Laura said, about what are some ways that you use stories? And you can just raise your hand or you could put it in the chat, whichever you feel comfortable. What are some ways that you use stories in your preaching? What are some ways that you use stories in your preaching? Again, you can just blurt it out, or you could put it in the chat, whatever you feel more comfortable with. But what are some ways that you use storytelling in your preaching? Oops.
This is Ian.
Go ahead, Ian.
I will say that not as much as I try to use storytelling, it's not really all that well. But being from Alaska, there was a a priest who used to wrap all the native stories in and to explain that, and would use that in his sermons.
Right,
And
right. So to kind of create a cultural connection, if you will.
right,
Yeah,
yes, very much so.
yeah. What are some other ways that you as preachers use stories? I've told Laura that you all are talkers, so don't disappoint me.
Well, there's some in chat that have been talking about using
Oh, I
it.
don't see the chat. Oh, I can't see the chat with this.
Yeah.
So thank you,
Yeah.
Laura. Go
So
ahead and read the
so
chat.
just
Thank you.
I'll give
Thank
a
you.
shout out to some of the conversation in chat. I mean, I think that there's a number of examples here about how we use story to build bridges, right? And Paul, you make the great point about how personal stories are connections, ways of taking the larger message that we might have and building a bridge back into the everyday. That's a really powerful use of story. And yeah, that idea of using your own personal experience as a way to invite others to see themselves in the work. And I really like the number of you who are talking about the way story can work as translation, right? The biblical stories, we'll talk a little bit later about parables because they are a really good example of the kind of 2-minute tale I'm talking about. But the truth is that we often need to retell a story to make it our own.
Great. Anyone else before we go on? I'm going to take go one more. But if you're dying to tell another example of how you use stories or why you use stories, we veered a little bit. That's kind of a joint thing, right? How we use stories and why we use stories. We've gone through some of that. I often use stories just as an introduction. Like I almost never start a sermon without a story, just as a way to introduce. Like that's kind of one of my things. And then, which is a way that I use them. And also, if there's um, a part of the sermon where I feel like it's getting a little technical or boring, then I'll often try to work a story in that piece to re-engage people's attention. I ask about this because there are different roles and stories, and you've talked about some of them. I want to share some of them that come from Tom Long's classic book, The Witness of Preaching, and how he talks about the use that how preachers throughout the centuries have used stories in their sermons. And one of the things he talks about is to persuade that, and this is really my primary way of thinking about preaching myself, is to think about um, I have an understanding of the what the gospel's claim is on us or what the text's claim on us is. And I try to persuade people that this makes sense for them to live into. And I put especially pathos, like stories are helpful. You know, you've got ethos, which is the person of the preacher. You've got logos, which is logic, and you've got pathos, which is the emotional connection. And stories are particularly helpful for both logos for ethos and for pathos. Pathos because the stories often provide an emotional connection to what you're talking about, and then logos because whether you're telling a story about yourself or about somebody else, you're showing a different side of yourself as a preacher than when you are simply talking about the theological claim of a text. Another thing that Tom Long says is that stories, they're called illustrations usually, and when illustrations started, when that word came on the scene um, for stories, that they say kind of compare it to a window on the text, which kind of explains what the passage is. So it's funny that even though stories are often better on the ethos and the pathos side, on the illustration, like it makes it clearer and helps you to explain, like in a logos way, the logical way, what a claim, maybe what a theological concept is, that a story can help you explain that theological concept.
That's great. That's
Um,
great.
parables, are the word parable means to set one thing beside another. And so, Jesus, so many of his parables begins, the kingdom of heaven is like, where he's comparing something about the realm of the world as God wants it to be with something that his listeners are very familiar with. And so the comparison piece is something we do in stories as well. I'm going to tell a story in a minute which compares one thing to another. Um, and then, of course, there's the engagement, where, as I mentioned, stories are a way to grab your listener back in. I think in today's world of short attention spans, that it's really critical to have, if you're preaching a 15 or 20-minute sermon, which I still usually do. I know some preachers preach shorter sermons now because of shortened attention span. I kind of think about it, well, I'm gonna give them a full sermon, but I'm going to try to have an illustration or a story in as a way back in for people whose minds are drifting, that they'll lock back into the sermon because a story is interesting for them to listen to. So those are some of the roles of stories in sermons. I'm going to stop my sharing for a second and just ask if if those bring up, having explained what Long said, if those bring up any other ideas for you about the roles of stories in your sermons.
I
I
would
think
just say that in my teaching, or learning, I often remember the point by remembering the story first.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Hopefully you can remember the point still, right? Like
yeah,
that's the problem, that you often, like, the story overwhelms the point, right? But yeah, but if you can use it as a way back in, because the stories lock into our mind
yeah.
more easily and more clearly. Yes, thank you.
I think somebody, if you're preaching in different pulpits, it's especially fun to tell a story that's personal that helps them get to know you. And you're not just sort of like, oh, you're somebody that's coming to talk to us. Okay, great. You
Yeah,
know, just share a little bit, gives an insight to you. And I did that a lot when I first got to my current call. And,
yeah.
especially I'm fun and I tell goofy stories about myself doing ridiculous things, when I was
Right,
younger or
right,
something. So
right.
just it kind of like levels that playing field a little bit for me.
Yeah, yeah, it creates a connection, right? And Becky, it's always good to see you. But I, I'm not going to say where I was, but I was somewhere where a new preacher was starting, and he was telling a lot of stories about himself. And I thought, oh, this is really smart. His strategy must be to help people get to know him. But the longer he stayed, the more he continued to tell stories about himself. So it was a little too much from my point of view. But especially when you're new, I think it's very helpful. Let's see. I see some in the chat. Or Lisa, go ahead while I'm looking at the chat.
Sure. I enjoy sharing stories, both as a way to get to know folks and for them to get to know me and to explicate text. But as I've been starting to put my feet into the AI world, I've been reading more and more about the challenges of using using stories that involve people besides yourself, even your family members, and how those stories, especially now that our worship services are live streamed and recorded on the internet, and how much we're sharing other people's stories without necessarily having their
Permission.
yes, it's one thing if it was just a closed sanctuary and you're just sharing the story with the people who are there, but now the stories are being shared more widely, and the potential for those stories to be co-opted by AI, even your voice and details about those stories. So it has actually, as I've started reading more about this, has actually given me a shadow side to the use of stories in preaching.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just to move back to Laura's piece. I think about stories like one. I think if you looked at that slide with the five things that Tom Long mentioned, I kind of think about the whole thing as like finding yourself in the claim of the gospel. That stories often, in a very kind of global sense, help us to find ourselves in the claim of the text, that it's an entry point and that is different from an explanation. It's a way to show and not tell what you're inviting people in as the claim. Laura encouraged me to tell you a story, a 2-minute tale and this is my most common 2-minute tale that I ever tell. So probably some of you have already heard this story, maybe more than once, because I often use it, but I'm going to do it because I can do it with no prep. So I'm just going to give you this story. When I was in seminary, I dropped my
Alexa,
laptop
louder.
computer. And I dropped my laptop computer and the screen went black. And I don't know if that's happened to you, but if you did, maybe
louder.
what I did. And oh, John, John, I don't know if you're talking to me or talking to someone in the room with you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to mute John. And then I'll start over again. Thank you. So anyway, I dropped my laptop computer. The screen went black. I go to look at the warranty, and it says does not cover accidental damages. And it is, if my memory serves, it is bolded and italicized and underlined, and it's like 72 font and has a big black box around it, does not cover accidental damages. And so I kind of slink into the room, back to the computer store where I had bought it, thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a student. How much is it going to cost me to get this computer repaired? And the guy behind the desk told me that they would pay for the whole thing. And that was the first bit of grace. The law, the warranty said does not cover accidental damages, but for some reason they said that they would pay for it. Well, it took them longer than they planned and longer than I wanted for them to fix it. So I called the store and I told the store manager, I'm a student. I really need my computer. Is there anything you can do to hurry it up? And she said, yeah, come in tomorrow and I'll give you a loaner. Again, not in the warranty. And so I go the next day and she says, well, they told me, I don't know who they was. She said, but they told me I couldn't give you a loaner. So I said, fine, I'm going to give this guy a new computer. Again, not in the warranty. And it turns out that this computer that they were giving, the nearest one that was closest to one I had a bigger hard drive and a faster processor and better software. And then again, not in the warranty. And then she's like processing the exchange. She's putting in what I paid before and what I owe now. She said, oh, this is your lucky day. As if I did not already know that it was my lucky day. She says, this is your lucky day. You get some money back. You get $300 back. Now, that's a completely true story. And I hope a completely true glimpse of God's grace for us. Cut. That's the end scene.
Awesome.
But I use that story as a way to enter into the parable of the workers in the vineyard, to help them understand themselves as the 5 p.m. workers and not the 6 a.m. workers. So that's an example of what I've done to help them find themselves in the claim of the text. Laura, I'll turn this back over to you.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see. And let me make it bigger. I had it minimized here. There we go. And I want to start by talking about why 2-minute tales. So the exercise I gave Chip was to think about what it means to tell a story in 2 minutes. And you're actually going to do this today. So we're going to go through thinking through what we can actually accomplish in 2 minutes. But 2 minutes isn't an arbitrary length of time. So 2 to 3 minutes is about the span of human working memory. So we can hold the beginning and the end in that amount of time. And you've all noticed, because most of us have to communicate meaning over longer periods of time, right? As in class, when I'm, setting forth a set of ideas, it may take me 15 or 20 minutes. And you probably noticed that sometimes by the time you're in minute 15, people seem to have forgotten what you said in minute 3, right? So for a story to really have impact, you need to think about the length of time people can hold things in their mind. And in fact, the 2 to 3 minute time period comes out of extensive study of cultural anthropology and folklorists who find this pattern of oral tales tend to be about this length. In fact, parables in the Bible tend to be about this length, 90 seconds to 2 minutes, maybe a longer one, we get closer to 3. They're not longer than that, right? And parables are a really great example of the function of oral storytelling or of oral traditions in a world in which books and reading were not necessarily wiring brains for longer messages. So story tended to be in this concentrated form. So when I teach storytelling, I often have my students practice this idea of the 2-minute tale. It's short enough to illustrate a larger point within a bigger argument, a piece of persuasion. Again, for you, it's preaching. For me, it might be a classroom lecture. It might be on the faculty floor where I'm advocating for something. But at 2 to 3 minutes, and today we're going to focus on 2 minutes, it's long enough to have an impact and short enough not to derail the larger message. It gives you about 200 to 300 words to work with. And once you actually look at what that amount of text is, right, it's less than a page. It's not a lot. So you have to really chisel down, and it gives you an instinct. It gives you gut about the shape of a story, and it gives you a very focused way to begin to develop your storytelling muscles. And over time, when you practice 2-minute tales, you get an internalized sense of that rhythm of how long that kind of short tale can last. And it begins to even change your improvisational storytelling. So we're going to do this today. We're going to look at this today. But my hope is that you can actually begin to think in your own everyday storytelling about putting a timer on and seeing what can you actually get done in that 2-minute period of time. So the thinking behind this, the way I teach students to do this is actually to borrow something from screenwriting, which is borrowing it from Aristotle, right? So the roots of what I'm about to talk about come from Aristotle's Poetics, but it was Robert McKee in his book called Story from the 1970s, which is really a groundbreaking book on screenwriting. This is the approach to screenwriting that has shaped most modern movies. And he uses this idea of story beats. Now, most stories that are longer form have multiple beats. But in 2 minutes, you can boil down a story to 3 beats. And particularly in persuasive contexts, particularly when you're going for an emotional punch or going for the idea of a transformation, like Chip's story about a recognition of the presence of grace, right? This form of story is simple, it works, and you can all do it. And you're all going to do it today. So welcome, this is my classroom. You won't have to talk, but you'll be using chat to tell me stories. So the simplified form of story beats is really this. Beat 1, the world before. You establish just enough so that the listener knows whose story this is and what's at stake. Most early amateur storytellers spend way too much time in the world before, right? They spend way too much time in the setup if you're gonna actually get to the second beat, which is actually the most important one. So you just really want to start further along than you think. Start in media res. Here is a moment. We're on the cusp of something happening, right? One character, one situation, one tension. Then you go to beat 2, which is called rupture. And rupture is when something happens, an event, an encounter, a question, a discovery, something breaks the world of beat 1. And it has to be irreversible, right? It has to be after this moment. We can't go back to not knowing or not having experienced the thing that has just happened, right? And the rupture is the heart of the tale. If you notice, in 2 minutes, the rupture can be roughly half of the story, right? It's where the story really happens. And beat 3, which is roughly 20 to 30 seconds, is the world after. You show and don't explain what has changed. And really, it's the contrast. You're going for the contrast between beat 1 and beat 2, where the story starts and where the story ends. Because in 2 minutes, in only 2 minutes, they still remember where you began, right? So we're going to play around with this idea today, thinking about the story. If we start with Chip's story, right? What is the world before in your story, Chip?
I wish that I had looked at this before. I would have structured a little
No,
differently.
I'm putting you on the spot. No, teaching.
It's
Gotta be
seminary.
uncomfortable.
It's my life at seminary. It's the life of a student without a lot of
Yes.
money, and it's a computer that works.
Yeah. 1 sentence. You should be able to do the world before in a sentence, right? Young Chip, a student with a broken computer. That's the world before. What's the rupture?
The rupture is that I was treated in a way I never would have imagined by
experience of unexpected.
My Best Buy of all places.
Exactly. An experience of unexpected good fortune, right? What's the world after? How has Chip changed because of this experience?
Yeah, if you heard the sermon, I would talk about how that you're more likely to, I didn't work this into the sermon, but you're more likely to show grace to other people if you understand yourself as having received grace.
But that's exposition.
Right.
Your story,
yeah.
The world after, is an understanding of grace, right?
Right.
The transformation there is a recognition of a world in which kindness is possible, right? More freely given than you understood it to have been before, right? Yeah. So what story beats help you do is take a kind of story that Chip is telling and learn how to chisel it down, because now you really understand the notes you need to hit. Note 1, note 2, note 3, right? So if Chip were my student, I would be giving him feedback on how well he hit these beats, right? I think Chip exhibits a lot of the things that pretty good storytellers do, that they can sharpen to become amazing storytellers, right? Your world before was a little long, right? We could have started sharper, zeroed in faster. The rupture, really leaning into the surprise of that, right? Really zeroing in on emotionally what's important there. The world after, I think you kind of nailed, except figuring out a really powerful 2-minute tale. I always tell my students, I want dead silence for 5 to 10 seconds after. So you have to land it, right? Which is the hardest thing about storytelling, figuring out how you land it. So again, the story, the shape of a 2-minute story is very clear. Where it becomes difficult is most times you're trying to get a story in and you're trying to make it a small little illustration. What happens? You load it with too much stuff, right? How many of you have done that? You're like, oh, I'll just tell a small story here. And 10 minutes later, you're still telling your story, right? So the 2-minute story practice is really about zeroing in on just this simple structure. The world before, who is the story about? What is the tension? What is the rupture, right? And then how do I stick the landing? How do I convey something about the power of what has just happened? So I'm going to give you an example from a 2-minute tale I use in my class. It has nothing to do with preaching, but it has to do with who I am. I'm a storyteller, and I'm going to tell it. This is one I've worked on. I actually was tinkering with it again last night, making it even closer to a 2-minute story, because sometimes I cheat in my own classroom. You know, I've got the power. I can go a few minutes longer. And this is a hard one for me to do. I deliberately chose this story because this is a story I've written a much longer essay about. It is a story that touches on a vast and complicated story about my own relationship to my mother, and about my own coming to understanding of my and my mother's very different relationship to our emotional lives. And I had to strip most of that out because I had 2 minutes. But in my own class, when I tell this story, I tell it because it is the story about how I learned about the power of story. And it's a story about how I learned from the power of a ghost. He lived in a box of photographs in my basement. His name was Eddie. He was my uncle, and he was dead, and we never, ever spoke about him. He was a mystery, and he called to me because he was also the mystery of my mother. She was the kind of mother who never cried. She lived in a world of fierce rationality, and I experienced every emotion in Technicolor and surround sound. So when I was 16, in what I'm proud to say was a brilliant display of epically bad timing, I blurt out in the middle of like rush hour traffic in New Jersey on Route 17, "Mom, whatever happened to Eddie?" And my mom freezes. She pulls over to the shoulder of Route 17. The car is shaking as big trucks are passing by. She takes a breath and she tells me, Eddie was her little brother, 8 years younger than her, and she'd raised him from the day he was born. One afternoon, just before high school graduation, he was playing in the backyard. He reached for a ball that rolled under a bush. He lost his balance and he fell. A freshly pruned branch caught his eye and lodged in his brain. Everyday play turned into trauma. Weeks of a coma turned into a decision that no family should ever have to make. And then, 3 days after his death, my brother was born. She had a toddler and a newborn and no room to drown. Her grief was immense, and she buried it all so it wouldn't cast a shadow on her children. And it didn't. My brothers and I grew up. We took risks. We ran after balls. We tromped through woods. We were scratched and scraped by 1,000 bushes. And we never knew fear. In that moment, resentment became wonder. And a story can do that. I realized that the core of my mother was this fierce love. She spent all her love building a shield over her children. And she gave to me the thing that she couldn't afford, the freedom to feel openly, to imagine without fear, and to pass on a story that she didn't know how to tell. Now, once my 5 minutes is over, 5 seconds, I usually connect this story to how this is a moment that I began to understand the relational power of story. That in a moment, in a story, my entire understanding of a person can be transformed. But the truth is that the 2-minute version of this story leaves out a whole bunch of things that are emotionally deeply important to me, but they don't matter to the audience I'm telling the story to. And so the 2-minute tale is about discipline, right? It's about chiseling down to what does matter. And what I want to do, the beats I'm trying to hit when I tell that story are these: the ghost in the box, the mother who's cold and distant, and the 16-year-old who has no emotional control, who is completely emo and blurts out the unsayable question, right, in the most inappropriate moments, right? There is, I hope, in my story, a suggestion of the deeper, deeply complicated relationship I had to my mother, but it is simply suggested because it isn't about me, right? There's another version of the story that is all about me, but this version is not. This version is about what happens when we tell a story that's been denied us, when I heard the story that I had never been allowed to know. The rupture is the story itself, right? The rupture is my mother's voice. It is my mother speaking the thing that was unspeakable to her. And the world after is the reframing of everything about my childhood. How could I not know this, right? How could my mother, who essentially was a mother figure to her little brother, how could she have undergone such a random trauma in play, right? And never, ever once told us to be careful when we ran out the door. She never did, not once. In that moment where I learned that thing about my mother, I understood that her reserve, that thing that I had bucked against my entire life, melted away into a wonder of the gift that she'd given me. So again, in this version of the story, I'm trying to focus just on the transformative power of a story. And I'm trying to hint a little bit of the emotional intensity of this story for me without having it become about me. Because I'm using myself, and this is something a lot of you noted in the chat. When we are in a position as teachers, as preachers, right, and we are using story to illustrate, we walk a fine line, don't we? Because we want to use ourselves to illustrate something, but we don't want to make it about us. And I think that conversation also about AI, about the sort of transferability of stories these days, the power of a 2-minute tale is it is also a shield for you. It helps you really chisel down and think intentionally about what this version of the story will be, what's worth disclosing. There are certainly things about my mother and my story with my mother that are nobody else's business. And yet, the first few times I told this story, guess what? They totally came out because they are part of my story. The 2-minute story is a discipline that really helps you take your experience and chisel it down into the experience your audience needs and your argument, your purpose needs.
Laura,
All right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Laura's not a preaching scholar, but some of you here are, and you might have heard of the Lowry loop. This is a structure that it is an inverted, visually it's inverted from what Laura did. If you can you go back to the graphic, please, Laura? There we go. So Eugene Lowry's a preaching scholar from Christian Theological Seminary. He's retired now, but he pictures it like this. It's a 5-step or a 4-step process, but it's the same version of this. And I think the brilliance of Laura's version of that simplified version is you can't get through 5 beats in a 2-minute tale. You can get through 3 beats in a 2-minute tale. So if this is kind of ringing something in your mind about something you've learned before, think about it as a slimmed down version of the Lowry loop.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the wonderful thing about the work that Chip and I have done together. At Alma, we have a strong emphasis on interdisciplinary conversations. And I think this is just one of many examples where my experience, my framework as a storyteller intersects in really interesting ways with conversations about story and preaching. Part of that, though, is because storytelling, it is universal. It is one of the things that we find across all cultures. It is something that our brains are wired to do. And it is how we make meaning. So it's something that we have thousands of years of making sense of. I want to shift now to have you guys actually do some thinking about how you can think about these 3 different beats. Some quick points of advice about thinking about a 2-minute tale is this. Again, first, start late. You have to enter closer to the moment of rupture than you think. And what I often do is, and this is in the handout, we may not have time to fully go through it in this workshop, but I call it the brain dump stage. So whenever you are ready to, and again, once you get really good at this, you can improvise 2-minute stories really well. But as you begin doing it, if particularly in the context of preaching, I recommend that you say, okay, this is a story I want to tell. Go through this process, do the brain dump, right? Sit there and write out, or sometimes I have students record themselves talking. There are really great tools now that can transcribe you while you talk. So for some of my students where I really want to emphasize oral storytelling, I'll have them record themselves with a transcription software program. And then I have them look at and think about that brain dump that here's organically how the story came out. It's always longer. It always has a huge setup. Why? Well, because our own brains are still finding the story, right? And that setup is important to us, but it's not as important to our audience. So do the brain dump, tell the longer version of the story, then go look at it and figure out where that moment of transition, where's the rupture? And then how close to the rupture can you get, right? How efficiently can you set up the rupture without losing too much meaning? It'll be hard because you will feel like you're losing stuff because you only have 2 minutes, right? The other thing is the other challenge that we can have when we start trying to tell these chiseled down 2-minute tales is that we try and make the story do too much. If it's in a sermon, if it's in a lecture, it needs to touch the larger arc in one place. So in Chip's case, it's that idea of kindness and grace, that it's there in the world. That's the thing it's telling. Don't make it do anything else. Just that point. Illustrate. A lot of you use that word illustration. Just focus on the thing it's illustrating. Do not give a complex cast of characters. Telling a 2-minute tale about me and my mother is really hard, right? Chip, him and his computer, that's a more doable thing in 2 minutes. The fewer the characters, the easier it is to really find that shape and tell it. Remember that for the story to land, it has to have a turn. It has to have that transformation. And this is really hard. You've probably had the experience of listening to a story that doesn't feel like it goes anywhere. It doesn't quite ever become a story. And that's because your brain is wired to look for that. There's lots of ways we can think about it. The old school, triangle with the rising conflict and climax. All of that stuff's great. It's also more complicated than you need to think about it. For a 2-minute story, you really just need to think the rupture, right? What is it that enables a turn? What is it that enables a transformation? If you look at your brain dump and you find that can build the structure. Everything else can be built around that. The hardest thing about storytelling is landing the ending. It's the thing I still struggle most with. You know when you nail it, right? It's like in the Olympics, when you do the perfect landing and you stick it, everybody tells and it's great. Everybody also knows when you fall on your feet. And you will, because it's really hard to stick the landing. The important thing to remember is you want to end on a line that you can shut up after for 5 to 10 seconds, right? What we do is when we don't trust our landing, we don't take that pause, we don't take that break, and we rush right into what? Commentary, explaining our story, right? But in the moment we have to explain our story, we take away our story's power. Let it sit. Let it stew for a minute. Let it ferment. That's how it has its power. Then you can move on. Then you can build the bridge. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to, and again, some of you, if you'd like to unmic and talk, you can do that. The rest of you, this can be a practice you do in the chat. But I'd like you all to think about an example of a story you use in preaching practice. So something like Chip's story about his laptop. And what I want you to do is not tell, if we had more time, if we were in class, I would actually pair you up and I'd have you with a timer, try and tell your tale in 2 minutes, okay? But what I want you to do now is actually identify the world before the rupture and the world after. Can you identify the beats, okay? So give everyone a minute, think of a story, think of its beats, and then I'd love it if 1 or 2 of you were willing to unmic to share, but you can also use the chat to share.
Laura, there's a question. Are you looking for 3 simple points or including explanation? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, no, that was the answer to, that was a response to our question. I think whatever makes sense for you. So I think give me the beats, and then if there's something else you want to share about it is fine. It's really just the exercise for each of you to try and think about those stories. Anybody want to share? Anybody have one that they want to share?
I'm very intrigued by Molly's example of the that she used on Trinity Sunday. Molly, would you mind sharing that?
Yeah. So I was trying to get to why would the Pentecost community share everything and sell their stuff and that kind of thing. And I'd read Dr. Keltner's book on awe and went, that's the key. And so I started with the fact that I was in utero when Armstrong walked on the moon. And so by accident of birth, I entered a globe that had seen the photograph of Earth in space from the moon. And the world shifted radically, globally, after those photographs. But I entered in that context. And so I talked about, it's not a mistake that Earth Day was organized in 1970, that our sense of smallness and our vulnerability and our unity, despite all of our disruptive behaviors, was shifted for a time. And I was struck that I experienced that again in 2026 with the Artemis II mission, and talking about these new technologies that allowed us to see even more about about that case, but that I was transfixed, partially because I'm a Gen Xer, watching the splashdown, because I knew bad things could happen to astronauts, right? So this isn't a good story until they're on Earth. But saying, the extreme sense of awe experienced by people all over the world happened again, and what is the possibility after that awe for what we're going to do with this new perspective, a renewed experience of the vulnerability and the smallness. And in fact, because of the science, right, we know there are billions of galaxies now. In 1970, we thought was a much smaller universe. So that was kind of my intake for awe, and then got me to the Pentecost and the post-Pentecost church.
I love that you start with a really clear understanding of the impact that you're after, right? That I want to get at awe. And I think really good storytelling begins by understanding how you want to move people, right? What is the emotion? So for instance, in the story that I told, I wanted it not to just be heavy. I wanted to have some of that sort of stupid, young, self-absorbed part of my worldview that completely had no grasp of the kind of depth and emotional complexity of my mother. And so that sort of framed my choices. And I love how you're talking about those same sort of things, because if we're not thinking of that impact, then we're not shaping the story in a way that it's going to land to move people the way we want them to move. Some other really interesting examples, and I don't know if any of you are able to unmic, but Mark, I love that example you give about the National Day of Prayer following 9/11. I mean, that really speaks to how important the context and the moment behind story is, right? A story is never in isolation. It's always about the moment in which it's being told. Okay, so these are all really great, and please keep posting them. I want to also make sure that we talk a little bit about where stories can go wrong. And I'm betting many of you have experience about this. Chip, you already gave us some suggestions to that, and I know people might still be sort of thinking about their 3 beats. You know, again, feel free in chat or to Mike if you want to contribute anything to here. Just to start with some, you know, some things we've already talked about. If the story doesn't connect to your actual point, it is so easy to get caught up in telling a story because we love it. Right, Becky, I see your head nod, right? Lisa too, right? We have stories we love and we work them in, even though they're not relevant, because we love telling them, right? And sometimes we can get away with that. I mean, I chose a job where I get paid to have a captive audience, you know? What does a repressed theater kid do? With not enough talent to actually become an actor, become a teacher. But again, realizing that our role is not just to entertain, and our role is not just to hog the spotlight. So if a story isn't connecting to the actual point, or we are not communicating that connection, right? Another thing that kills a story is explaining it to death. And this is a place where I think I have been in the pews and heard this happen. I have also heard myself do it, right? And I've certainly seen my colleagues do it. A powerful story, it can be explicated, right? But it shouldn't need a blow-by-blow analysis, right? Its power is in its ability to communicate. If we have to communicate what it communicated, we didn't tell it right, right? The other thing that goes wrong is that it doesn't have any life to it. And this is kind of where I want to go for the last part of this. What are some things that you can do to be sure that when you tell a story, it has life? Now, the beats help, right? I absolutely think about those 3 beats. If you have a rupture, if you have a moment, a turn, you will have some life to your story, and you will naturally tell it better because you understand that part of the story. The story can't be about you, even if it's about you, right? If you're always the hero, I put the example of the preacher here, but it's just as true for instructors. I mean, I cannot tell you how many of my colleagues I've read student opinion surveys that say all so-and-so ever does is tell us a story about them or their dog, right? And those professors may have a reason they're telling those stories, but it actually comes off as narcissistic or as self-absorbed. And even very well-meaning people who are not those things can be perceived that way because they're not being mindful enough about how to make a story about you, not about you, right? And again, I think in Chip's case, in my case, we've all told stories about ourselves, trying to think really carefully about how that story was an illustration of something that was not about us. I think of my story as not really about me. I actually think the story is about my mother. And I'm the narrator of my mother's story, which is literally true because my mom still doesn't talk about the death of her brother. And yet I have talked to everyone in my family. I've written about it. I am the official narrator of my uncle's life now because no one else in my family will tell the story. Borrowed and overly familiar illustrations. The story isn't new. It doesn't feel fresh, falls flat. And then the story overwhelms the sermon, right? The story is what people remember, but they have no idea why. Chip, are there some things that you think this leaves off? Are there other things that you think are important within the context of preaching about how stories can go wrong?
I think that I'm thinking of one really, really bad illustration that I used. I happen to have had a very well-paying job before I went to seminary, and it took me a while, took me too long to learn that illustrations of that time in my life were very off-putting for people in the pews, even though if I had been telling them in a different context of people who had been my peers, when I was working as a management consultant, they would have been fine, but I wasn't telling them in those kind of contexts. And so I learned that that when you're sharing things about yourself, share things that will help them feel more connected to you, not less connected to you. And I was sharing stories that made people feel less connected to me. But I'm sure that I hope that you all can also think about stories that you told that did not work out and could analyze why. I'd be glad to hear from you as well. Christine,
Oh,
so
Christine, I love that. Yeah, when you're telling stories about, Christine mentions, telling stories about your day job, or about your other job. Yeah, again, I want to be clear. I think telling stories about ourselves is good if it is a bridge, right? If it is, and the other thing that can be powerful is stories about ourselves because we're testifying, or because we're bearing witness, right? I do think of the story about my mother's brother as a kind of form of witnessing, right? That until I was allowed to know that story, I couldn't bear witness to what my mother carried. And until I knew what she carried, I did not know her. And what I knew was a false image of my mother. And I feel like it's really important to carry that story forward. I really do feel like the story became mine. I have some obligation. And I think those sort of reasons are good reasons to talk about ourselves.
another when I was a early preacher, just the tendency to make stories about yourself that just do not need to be. I wanted to I was preaching on the widow and the judge, the parable of the widow and the judge. And my opening illustration was about how my aunt really liked to watch Murder, She Wrote, and I did not like to watch it. And my preaching professor told me, you can tell this story without having you in it at all. You can just tell this story about how Murder, She Wrote was a popular show. It doesn't have to be like I don't have to insert myself
Yeah.
about why I don't like this show and why my aunt likes this show. I might tell my friends that, but in a sermon, what's more important is there was this widow that was in everyone's screens in the 80s, I guess, or 90s, that was very popular in America. That was the entryway.
And again, I think one of the values of the 2-minute tale is it forces you to be brutal, right? It forces you to chisel away the stuff and make those decisions. And it makes it easier to really understand what matters. So I want to talk a little bit about how to bring a story to life. This is something that Chip and I, as we were preparing for this, we talked a little bit about that the old adage in creative writing classes is always, show, don't tell. I'm imagining many of you have heard that phrase. Now, the truth is, in a 2-minute tale, you got to make real careful choices about that, because if you're showing everything, you're going to have a really long, really descriptive tale. And yet, really precise choices can bring a story to life. And so in chat, I have an assignment for you. Choose one of these questions in a no more than a sentence, and not actually using the word itself. So in other words, don't tell me she looked sad. She looked, I want you to describe one of these 3 things in a sentence using descriptive language. And as a hint to the next slide, I encourage you to think about sensory detail. Each of these is, by the way, a sense. What does grief look like? Right? How would you look at somebody and see grief? What does sadness taste like? Right? What does joy sound like? In a sentence, try and convey, without using that word, without directly evoking that emotion, using either sight, taste, or sound, convey to me grief, sadness, or joy. Good stuff. Oh, I love that, Molly. Never have I matched the magic of grandmother's chocolate quake cookies. Joy sounds the stream of water rolling in the woods. An unexpected moment to go get greeters ice cream. Yeah, in the morning I rolled over and felt my wife's fist. Yes, you guys get it. Yes. So a baby giggles, right? The depths of a dreary pit, right? Thinking about sensory images, because that is how we experience the world, right? And so by evoking a sensory image and sensory language, we actually trigger those images and senses or echoes of them in the brains of the people who are listening to us. And so that's one of the things that makes a story feel alive. Oh, Grace, I love yours. Grief looks like dark blue water swallowing me up. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. A phrase like that conveys that sense of drowning, the sense of feeling overwhelmed. And again, each of you, we may describe grief differently. Grief may look different or feel different or look different to different people. But thinking about that, John, I love yours. My dog bounding around the yard. I'm betting you're a dog person too. I think of everything happy as my Bernese mountain dog who's on my phone. Okay, so some really quick techniques for showing, right? In the limited time that we have. Again, part of my job in a workshop like this is to streamline and simplify everything into quick takeaways, right? So I think there's 3 things you can think about as you're telling your story to help you move from telling to showing. 1, telling detail, right? A sensory moment that conveys an emotion, a character, a state, or the ambiance of the setting. You all just did it. If you put something in chat, you know how to do this, right? A telling detail. There are some examples in the handout that I linked in chat up at the top of the session. The loaded action. A great example of this in my story is the moment my mother freezes. My mother froze, right? Well, that conveys a set of emotions. It describes a moment of pressure. My mother's sense of tension about confronting the story she doesn't want to tell me, right? And I don't need to say any of that because I can just say my mother froze, right? And it conveys much more than a lot of exposition would. The final one is a sharp image, right? Replace a summary about an effect. So we tend to sometimes want to summarize the impact or effect of things. In my earlier versions of this story, I had entire paragraphs about the transformative impact this moment had on my mother and how it shaped. And yeah, great. That's for the longer essay. For this thing, I need an image, right? And so for me, it was the image of my own childhood, right? The contrast of my own childhood running free with the image of my uncle's death, right? And the tension between those 2 things says everything I need to say, really, about what my mother and this sort of emotional reserve that drove me crazy as a child, how that broke open by just the contrast of those images. In 2 minutes, you have to make every choice count, right? And again, in your real preaching practice, you won't always keep it to 2 minutes. I'm under no illusions. In fact, in the handout and the slide later, I talk about, it doesn't have to be 2 minutes. This is an exercise, right? This is an ab crunch for your storytelling that will sharpen your skills if you practice it. The other thing, regardless of your length of story, I recommend that you start doing a practice of story audits, which means that when you're preparing for your sermon, preaching context in which you know you're going to tell a story, ask yourself these 5 questions. The first is the so what test. And can I say in just a clause, this story shows that blank, right? And again, this is where the have you really clarified if it's about you or not matters, right? In my case, this story shows that a story can transform your understanding of another person. In Chip's case, it might be, this story shows that grace and kindness show up in unexpected places, right? It's the moral, right? The thing you don't ever say in the story, right? Because your story shows it. Who's the hero test? Who comes out looking good in this story? Now, what I really love about my story is it's not me, right? It's my mother, right? The woman that I spent my entire adolescence bashing and saying she was ruining my life. Turns out, no, this woman is a hero, right? She is the fiercest, strongest person I know. And it took an idiot to ask a completely inappropriate question, blindside her for me to realize that. Would they know it test? Would someone from my congregation recognize the world this story comes from? This one is really important as a teacher, for you as a preacher. If you're telling a story about a world that your audience has no access to, tell it with care. There are times to tell those stories, right? But you need to be aware of that. One thing I talk about in the in-person workshop that I've done for the Synod is the idea of being aware of the stormtrooper, right? So every story, this happens in the Bible, it happens in how we tell our own storytelling, and it happens in Star Wars, which is where I draw my example. We make certain people into just props of our story, right? And the net effect of that can result in somebody in your audience who identifies with that thing we've turned into a dehumanized prop. They can feel left out. We can tell a story that they have no connection to. So for instance, if I am teaching a class of struggling readers and I describe spending the summer rereading Moby Dick for the 5th time and really enjoying how it connected to having reread some French philosophy, I've lost them, right? Now, maybe because I'm not a struggling reader, the story I should tell is about my own struggle to show up in calculus in my first semester in college, because that's the struggle, that's the world that they'll recognize as their own. The clock test, get a timer, right? Practice it. We all know this, right? In our head, it's going to take 10 minutes. When we actually get there, we are already way behind where I thought we would be, how long this, I plan now to over plan. I know I will never get to everything I always plan to do. Things always take longer. The final thing is the trust test. If you feel the urge to explain the story when it's over, one of two things is true. Your story needs work, or you don't trust it, right? If you feel you have to explain your story, keep working on your story, or learn to trust yourself as a storyteller, right? Again, I'm not saying you can't explicate certain parts of the story later on. I'm not saying you can never speak about your story. But if the first impulse you have is to explain your story to somebody else, right, then that's a challenge. Yeah, great stuff in the chat about how important mindful storytelling is right now. I find that there's two things happening. There's this sort of pop culture objectification, but as we become more aware of the complexity of people's identities, we can step in it unintentionally. I think that storytelling requires tremendous humility. I have definitely had times where I've looked at people and said, thank you for sharing that my story did not have that impact that I wanted on you. I will take the note and keep working on being a better storyteller. Okay.
Laura,
yeah,
just before you go back
sure.
up in the chat, Grace had a question and a comment. I'm trying to find it. It was before all of the. Oh, here we go. Grace said, when I hear, quote, personally invested story, quote, even if it is not about the teller, it touches me more deeply. I wonder what makes them more engaging. Yeah. Grace, do you want to say more about that?
When I hear the story, I feel like I can hear, I can feel how much that story is personally invested in touch the person teller.
Yeah.
It's not just a beautiful story, not just a well structured. Somehow, when the person, I think it's just a show, and it touches listener, and I was contemplating on what that is, and
No,
I feel when I tell too.
no,
Um,
I love that. I mean, we are wired for story. It's how we build relationships. Um, it's how we build connections, and it's how we make meaning. And so I think there's something vulnerable about kind of there's a kind of way in which what you're talking about when somebody's personally invested in a story, they're revealing something to you. There's a trust component to that that's probably important.
so are you saying the story that shares somehow the speaker's vulnerability
Mhm.
has a power to move the audience?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think in my own, I'm not a minister, but there is something like a ministry in what I do. In addition to my work as storyteller, I am currently I'm the associate provost, which makes me the vice principal, which means that I'm the one who deals with all the students in trouble. And one of the things I often do, and I imagine it's quite similar to what preachers do in their own ministry, is sometimes when I am dealing with somebody who I know might view me with suspicion, or somebody who might feel very defensive about what's about to happen, right? They've cheated in a class, or they're having mental health issues and it's impacting their academic success. I'll often begin with a story about myself because it makes me relatable. It helps them understand that I'm human. Grace, if you think about it, really what you're talking about is the story I told. Because my mother never shared with me anything about this massive part of who she was, I felt like I never knew my mother, right? I felt the wall even when I didn't know that's what it was. And a lot of my own challenges were about bumping up against the wall I didn't even know was there. The moment that story was shared, right? It took time, but my trust in my mother, everything really began to change. And I think that that's part of this neurological component of story. It releases chemicals in our brain. Those chemicals trigger bonding and connection. We really are wired for story in a really profound way. Yeah.
Laura, I think we just opened up when you say the walls between you and mom. And as a preacher and the pastor of the church, what kind of a wall are we unconsciously build up between us and the listeners?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. Yeah. And in some ways, walls are okay, right? I mean, as a preacher, as a teacher, there are boundaries that we have to draw. That's kind of that conversation we had before about not oversharing, right? At the same time, we have to build trust. And I think, Grace, a lot of what you're talking about there is the role of story in building trust. And when somebody is willing to reveal something about themselves, tell a story about themselves, you feel on some level they're willing to put themselves out there. I'm kind of curious what Chip and the rest of you feel about that. I think it's probably the line that marks the profession in many ways.
Yeah, Grace, I love that. It makes me think of an article by Walter Brueggemann, where it talks about how there's in preaching, you can kind of think about there's the text, there's the preacher, and there are the listeners, and that sometimes preachers preach as if they and the text are over the listeners, and that creates walls. So if you're telling stories about how you finally got through to a parishioner about what it looks like to be generous, that puts yourself as the hero. It creates a barrier between you. But if you tell a story about how you struggled with the idea of showing grace to someone else, and that welcomes them in, that they see, oh, the preacher isn't perfect. The preacher is going through the same things we are. I want to listen to this preacher, that it tears down the walls.
That's great. So I want to just briefly talk about something that's in your packet and then have a little bit of time for some closing thoughts. So in that packet, again, it should be up at the top of the text chain there, a link to a handout. At the end of it, there is an exercise called From Brain Dump to Polished Tale. And it just takes you through this 3-step process that I encourage you to do if you really want to go further with this, which is you need a partner. You sort of do a brain dump, just sort of write out your first, again, and if you don't want to write, talk into record yourself. And then you spend a few minutes, don't make it like 2 hours, really give yourself, 5 minutes to try and shape that story. Then tell that story to somebody else in 2 minutes, right? And then have them tell back what they heard. When you want to become a better storyteller, one of the best things you can do is get people to mirror what they took from your story back to you. And that's how you begin to learn, did they get what I thought, right? Or did my story miss the impact or miss the message that I wanted it to have? I tortured my roommate in college because I would just constantly interrupt her studying. She was an econ major. I'd say, wait, can I just read this to you? But her patience and her willing to mirror back to me, it was critical in that sort of early phase of me finding my voice and figuring out who I was as a storyteller. Boy, do I owe that woman for her patience. So that's there as a resource. The handout has a lot of the other things that we talked about, just as sort of a takeaway, because the truth is, in a 90-minute session like this, hopefully we've opened up some doors and some possibilities, but learning only happens through play. In order to really learn how to be a better storyteller, you have to play with telling stories. And so hopefully that's just a resource there for you if and when you want to play with some of these 2-minute tale strategies. The challenge you will have is, of course, you have to let go of a lot of things to tell the story. And sometimes you may cut too much. Sometimes you may realize there's something you need to bring back into the story, but it really does help you develop a more precise and effective story. What I'd like to end with is just having you think about what's one takeaway from you for this session. I have up here, and this is in the handout too, just there are alternate timeframes you can play with. 2 minutes is not arbitrary, but 60 seconds, ooh, that's tough to really nail those elements of a story in 60 seconds. 90 seconds is actually the average time of parables, so Jesus could do it. 3 minutes, that extra minute is really good if what you need to do is add another character or just to add a little bit more complexity. At 5 minutes, you're doing extended narrative preaching at that point. If your tale is going 5 minutes, especially if you have like a 20-minute sermon, you're talking 25% of your message is your story. And so really be sure that has the emotional impact and the shape to carry people through that length of time. 5 minutes is easy to do. It's much harder to do it well. And again, if you get good at these smaller chunks of story, elaborating that, extending this skill out to longer periods of time is easier than fully than working in that larger span of time to perfect these skills. So the precision of the smaller time really does help. So again, if you're willing to share, just in chat, one thing you might be interested in taking away, one thing from today you might want to tinker with or try, or also, is there a story your congregation is waiting for you to tell? Something that only you can tell. Yes. Oh, the moth. Some of you mentioned the moth. is a really great series that they do 5 minutes. And you'll notice that those stories, if you have listened to them off the story slams, those stories are a lot more complicated. It takes some real story chops. It's a great way to learn some good storytelling techniques. Great.
I'm kind of curious to go back and look at the stories like I've told recently to see like how much of my sermon they do take up. Like, are they,
Yeah.
90 minutes, good golly. I preach like 10 minutes.
Then we need to talk, Becky. If they're 90 minutes, there are bigger issues there.
There are bigger issues. Just in terms of like how long and am I being as succinct as I think I am, or do I need to, really kind of work on getting to the point, which my husband tells me all the time.
I'm afraid our time is up. Laura, thank you so much. Let's give some happy hands again to Laura. It was great to learn from you. I think that for me, I'll just say, I have a PhD in this stuff, and because this is interdisciplinary, I have learned a lot in this workshop, and I'm really grateful for your work and your help and your enthusiasm and your willingness to, I think, you very carefully took what you know about storytelling in all sorts of ways and really helped us thinking about it for preaching specifically. So thank you for the work you did for that.
Well, I love the conversation because I don't own story. Hearing more about how each of you work with story is fascinating to me. So thank you. I do pay Chip $20 every time he says a good thing about me. So
which is regularly.
your checks in the mail.
Yeah.
Laura, thank you guys.
Do you have time to stick around in case anybody has a one-on-one question for you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. So I'll just remind you that next month it's July 8th, not July 1st. It's about preaching on immigration with Safwat Marzouk. And let me close this in prayer. And if you have a question or a comment for Laura, stick around. Gracious God, thank you so much for the chance to think about stories, your use of them through your Son, Jesus Christ, and our use of them. So God, help strengthen our preaching from what we've learned today. In Christ's name, amen. Bye-bye, everyone.